major change happened in American strategic way of doing things in the past 35 years. In 1990, 1991, 1992, basically the very beginning of the supremacy of the US as the sole superpower in the world began after the end of the Cold War, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, with a major event that was the invasion by Iraq of Kuwait. And an international coalition led by the United States came to be formed, and its objective was to expel Iraq under Saddam Hussein from Kuwait. The modus operandi, the way of operations of America in that struggle, in that war, was very specific, very, very specific. And that was to effectively eliminate the Iraqi power on the ground super fast and without direct engagement with it, and certainly without American presence on the ground. And how did that happen? By colossal use of remote power, missiles, use of air force, and the idea again was to end the war super quickly without assuming any responsibilities by the Pentagon, by the American armed forces on the ground. And to some extent, that came to be known as the doctrine of Norman Schwarzkopf, who led the American, or the coalition led by America, war against Saddam Hussein, and later on became the Colin Powell doctrine. Colin Powell, at the time, was a leading senior American general, and 10 years, the beginning of the 2000s, became actually America's foreign or Secretary of State under the George Bush II administration. Anyway, that way of dealing with opponents by the United States continued throughout the 90s. And for those who remember that in the 90s there was a major Balkan war in which the collapse of Yugoslavia resulted in immense wars in the Balkans, and the NATO, the North Atlantic coalition, led by the United States, engaged in that war against Serbia in particular, and there was exactly the same utilization of power by America. That was missiles, use of air force, elimination of the opponent's ability to conduct the war, and effectively achieve the objective remotely, without America's direct engagement on the ground, without the presence of American soldiers on the ground. That was the doctrine that America had throughout the 1990s. But that changed dramatically after September 11th, 2001. That was the time of the rise of a group of thinkers, strategists within the United States called the neoconservatives. And the ideas of the neoconservatives became very clear in America's occupation of Afghanistan, 2002, I think, and then Iraq in 2003. In these two wars, America used missiles and colossal air force to destruct the fighting power of its opponents, but that was step number one. Followed after that was actual engagement on the ground to actually occupy the countries, have tens of thousands and often hundreds of thousands of American soldiers on the ground, not just to occupy the entirety of these countries, but to build new states, to effectively create new regimes. That meant that the Pentagon, the American Armed Forces, Defense Ministry, and behind it, the apparatus of the American state, undertook major responsibilities on the ground. And these responsibilities transcended military ones. So it was not just occupying the countries. When you think of building a state, you take into your mind political state building, anthropological, social work, of course, economic work. So the responsibilities, the scope of work of the American state on the ground in Afghanistan, in Iraq, was dramatically large. It also entailed creating very large American bases in these countries. And American bases are not just places where you host the soldiers and the planes, and they are almost small cities on the ground. They entail supermarkets and restaurants and ways of living that are very American and that could be and must be self-sufficient. That the soldiers there, the people stationed there, need not even to engage with the societies around them. The point I'm trying to say that in the 20 years, from roughly 2002 until 2020, say, the American way of conducting war was vastly different from the early 1990s. It was actually the exact opposite. It was direct, hands-on engagement with thousands upon thousands of soldiers on the ground, taking on immense responsibilities. All of that changed in the last 3 or 4 years, primarily under the administration of President Donald Trump, who came to the White House with the idea that there's no need for America to take on all of such responsibilities, that America needs to delegate a lot of these responsibilities to its allies. And therefore, in the past 2-3 years, particularly in the war over Ukraine or the war on Ukraine, we have seen that America is, of course, providing a lot of support, whether it is in terms of ammunitions, in terms of thinking, in terms of intelligence, training to Ukraine. But in addition to that, it has insisted that its allies in NATO, in the North Atlantic Military Alliance, do, in Europe basically, they do undertake a lot of the responsibilities that normally America would have undertook when it comes to providing ammunitions, when it comes to some financing, when it comes to some logistical stuff that are needed in the war. That is a tremendous change in the American doctrine of conducting war. Why is these shifts in American strategic way of engagement are very important? Number one, because of course it is very relevant for anyone interested in the strategic confrontation between America and China. Number two, because if we assume that there is a scenario in which China might at one point in the future use force, use military action in East Asia, the way America has shifted its strategic doctrine can be very important for us to think, how will America engage in East Asia in such a scenario?